Welcome to this video where I start to take a look at a work by the Polish logician and philosopher Stanisław Leśniewski, titled A Critique of the Logical Principle of the Excluded Middle. The original Polish title, including typographical error, is Krytyka Logicznej, Zasady, wyłączonego, środku. This work originally dates back to around 1913 and is one of Leśniewski's first published works. In this video I'll attempt to explain some of the details of this work, and I won't be going through line by line, but I will highlight certain passages which I find interesting. The original work was, as you may have guessed, written in Polish, therefore I've attempted to translate some of this work into English, and I'll show on the screen my translations of some of the passages which I discuss. There are some paragraphs which are a bit waffly and don't really push things forward, and can in fact be a bit confusing sometimes. There are also other paragraphs where, though I can get the idea of what Leśniewski is talking about, I haven't really been able to translate the text into English in a way that I've been happy with. However, I think I will be including in this video the parts of the work that are most important. So just a few comments before we get started. Firstly, and as I've already mentioned, in some of my other videos, I'm not a professional translator, and Polish is not a first language for me. Therefore, there may be some passages which I've not translated correctly, so I make no claims about the accuracy or reliability of my translations. They're simply the best that I was able to produce at this point in time, and there are certain figures of speech that I don't fully understand the meanings of, since, again, Polish is not my first language. However, I'm always open to constructive criticism. If you do see something that I've mistranslated, then please let me know. I don't receive a single penny for any of the translations or videos that I make, so if they do seem a bit amateurish, then you know why. Secondly, it's often very difficult to understand some historical works by various authors for several reasons. The ideas that they discuss may have been superseded and are not really considered anymore in the contemporary literature. Indeed, the author may not even have been much discussed in their own time. The authors may refer to other authors who are little known or whose works are difficult, if not practically impossible to obtain. And the author may also refer to a variety of other theories which take time to research and understand. And since I'm not associated with any academic institution, I don't have access to any large physical or digital libraries or other academic staff. Therefore, I have to make do with what I can get my hands on and try to make the most of the time that I have available to me. The contents of this video are not on a scholarly or academic level. The video is made by an amateur who does this kind of thing for a hobby. I make these videos to help myself better understand things and simply to make freely available my thoughts and notes to others who may or may not benefit from them. I don't doubt that there will be individuals out there who know much more about these sorts of things than me. If any of those individuals would like to give me any relevant and constructive feedback, then I'd be very grateful for their help. So this work is split into 8 sections, with each section containing several uwagi, or notes. The sections often start with Leśniewski outlining some aspect of his theory in a couple of paragraphs, and then this is followed up by several notes highlighting various potential problems or criticisms, in which the author then attempts to resolve and or clarify these issues. In the introduction we read regarding this work, I here anticipate its final result. The logical principle of the excluded middle not only does not clarify more or less complicated logical problems, but in fact is very damaging theoretical deadweight to science, and for this reason deserves to be removed. It is a false thesis and, as with all false theses, it should be eliminated from scientific circulation. What Leśniewski means by the logical principle of the excluded middle will be clarified later in the video. In this video I'll be presenting Leśniewski's work as it is. In other words, I won't necessarily be going into detail about any issues with his arguments, but I will try as best I can to clarify any points that I think are unclear. I don't agree with all of Leśniewski's arguments, and I'm sure that there are counter-arguments for each of his arguments. Therefore, I'm not saying that Leśniewski's arguments are correct. I simply find his ideas interesting, even if I'm not entirely convinced by some of his ideas. Note that Leśniewski's arguments can often feel very repetitive. This can be annoying sometimes, but in my opinion this repetitiveness is necessary for maximal clarity. A quote from Wikipedia concerning Leśniewski, which I've saved, but which has since apparently disappeared from Wikipedia, reads as follows. The extreme rigour which Leśniewski applied in logic was ingrained in his character. He didn't tolerate any exceptions to any rule, irrespective of whether the rule was sensible or not. After one of his earlier essays in Polish was printed with an orthographical error in the title, środku instead of środka, he always cited the incorrect title, since a correction of the title would be breaking the rule that a citation must be exactly verbatim. The translation of this quote into English isn't mine, and unfortunately I have no idea now who the original quote is attributed to. Okay, so let's start at the beginning, which seems like a good place to start. In section 1, Leśniewski claims that the various propositions which are called the principle of the excluded middle can be split into two separate categories. On the one hand, we have propositions which relate to all objects in general. These forms of the excluded middle Leśniewski calls metaphysical propositions, though he also says that they may be referred to as ontological propositions. With this latter term, ontological, he makes a connection with the work of Łukasiewicz. On the other hand, we have propositions which relate to the class of objects called propositions, and these forms Leśniewski calls logical propositions. Examples of the first metaphysical or ontological forms are: every object must either possess each property or not possess each property. Every object must either possess property C or not possess property C. Every object must be, with respect to each property, either in a relation of possessing it or in a relation of not possessing it. Examples of the logical forms are: at least one of two contradictory propositions must be true. If one of two contradictory propositions is false, then the second must be true. This article is concerned with the logical forms of the excluded middle, which explains what is meant in the title Critique of the Logical Principle of the Excluded Middle. That is, Leśniewski is concerned with those forms of the excluded middle which relate specifically to propositions. Leśniewski has already dealt with the metaphysical or ontological forms in his paper titled An Attempt to Prove the Ontological Principle of Contradiction, in which he uses the term metaphysics to symbolize a system of true propositions about all objects in general. Leśniewski also explains what he means by logic. He says that he uses the word logic to denote that part of science of which the task is to indicate which propositions are true and which are false. In note 1 of section 1, Leśniewski explains that metaphysical propositions, which are about objects in general, are not concerned with general objects. More is said about what is meant by general object in the next note. Metaphysical propositions can be contrasted with propositions that relate not to all objects, but only to some. So examples are: some objects possess properties C1, C2, C3 to Cn. Every object which possesses properties C1', C2' to Cn' possesses properties C1, C2 to Cn. Some objects which possess properties C1', C2' to Cn' possess properties C1, C2 to Cn. Some examples of propositions about general objects are: every general object possesses the properties C1, C2 to Cn. Some general objects possess the properties C1, C2 to Cn. Every general object possessing the properties C1', C2' to Cn' possesses the properties C1, C2 to Cn. Some general objects possessing the properties C1', C2' to Cn' possess the properties C1, C2 to Cn. Notice that these propositions sometimes relate to all general objects and sometimes only to some general objects. Propositions about general objects can be contrasted with objects about individual objects. Examples of propositions about individual objects are: every individual object possesses properties C1, C2 to Cn. Some individual objects possess properties C1, C2 to Cn. Every individual object which possesses properties C1', C2' to Cn' possesses the properties C1, C2 to Cn. Some individual objects possessing properties C1', C2' to Cn' possess properties C1, C2 to Cn. Leśniewski ends this note by saying that propositions about general objects, which supposedly stand in opposition to individual objects, cannot be metaphysical propositions since they don't concern individual objects and therefore are not propositions about all objects in general. In note 2, Leśniewski articulates that various authors seem to have meant different things by the notion of general object. He mentions the ideas of medieval realism, the general ideas of Locke, the objects of general representations of Twardowski, and Husserl's ideal objects existing outside of time. We don't need to know the details of these different meanings of general objects, which is fortunate because I for one don't know about all of these. We just need to be aware that there are different interpretations of the concept of general objects, but that the different interpretations themselves have a common characteristic property. A general object is relative to some class of individual objects. A, possibly the, general object corresponding to a certain group of individual objects is allegedly an object which possesses only those properties which are possessed by all of the individual objects in the given class. Thus, any property which is not common to all of the individual objects to which a general object corresponds is not a property of the general object. Thus, the concept of a triangle of the realists, the general idea of a triangle of Locke, the object of the general representation of a triangle of Professor Twardowski, the ideal triangle in general of Husserl, possess the property of triangleness, but do not possess, for example, the property of equilateralness or isosceles-ness, which are properties not of all individual triangles, but only some. Leśniewski argues that these general objects don't exist because we can always find a property which the general object simultaneously has and does not have. And so this will be a contradiction. Leśniewski says that he'll try to formulate his proof in the most general form possible. So let's have a look at the argument. Assume that there is a general object, P sub k, which corresponds to the individual objects P1', P2' up to Pn'. For object Pk', choose a property Ck, which is possessed by Pk', but is not common to all of the individual objects. Therefore, the general object Pk does not have property Ck, since it's not common to all of the individual objects to which the general object supposedly corresponds. Since Pk' has property Ck, then Pk' does not have the property of not having property Ck. So the property of not having property Ck is not common to all of the individual objects, since some individual objects have property Ck and some do not. So the property of not having property Ck is not a property of the general object Pk. In other words, the general object Pk does not have the property Ck and does not have the property of not having property Ck. But not having the property of not having property Ck is equivalent to having the property Ck. So the general object Pk does not have the property Ck and has the property Ck, which of course is the contradiction. Therefore, the assumption that there is a general object is false. Leśniewski goes on in the next paragraph to show that the objects Pk, Pl, Pm, and Pn, with the meanings concept of a triangle in the sense of the realists, general idea of a triangle in the sense of Locke, objects of the general representation of a triangle in the sense of Twardowski, ideal triangle in the sense of Husserl, respectively, and not general objects at all, by using a similar method to that used in the previous paragraph, applied to each of Pk, Pl, Pm, Pn separately, by showing that these objects do not possess the property of equilateralness, since this is not a property common to all triangles, and yet they each do not possess the property of not possessing the property of equilateralness, i.e. they possess the property of equilateralness, which is a contradiction. Leśniewski concludes with, if my reasonings in the present note turn out to be true, then there would be a proof of a death sentence for realism, conceptualism, the theory of general representations of Professor Twardowski, the idealism of Husserl, and similar theories. In note 3, Leśniewski anticipates a potential criticism that may be directed towards his definition of logic. Recall that Leśniewski defines logic as that part of science of which the task is to indicate which propositions are true and which are false. Leśniewski anticipates that some may think that he is effectively reducing all scientific problems to logical problems. He says, It may be that someone understands it in the following way. Let us take some problem of the kind as, for example, the problem whether the thesis that all bodies are heavy is true or false. This problem is a problem of physics, but since it concerns the truth or falseness of a certain proposition, it is in the spirit of the above definition of the expression logic a logical problem. Similarly, the geometric problem whether Pythagoras' theorem is true or false must be a logical problem. Similarly, this is the case with all other scientific problems. If the meaning of the expression logic is thus expanded, the only possibility in this case is that all science becomes logic. Leśniewski says that this is erroneous, since the problem of whether the thesis that all bodies are heavy is true or false is not a problem of physics at all, as is claimed, since it concerns propositions, not bodies. Leśniewski's example is to consider the problem, is the thesis that all bodies are heavy true or false? The possible responses to this are, for example, the thesis that all bodies are heavy is true, or the thesis that all bodies are heavy is false. And therefore, since this is a problem of deciding whether a certain proposition is true or false, then it's a logical problem. But, Leśniewski argues, this logical problem is related to another problem which is not a logical problem, but a physical problem. That is, are all bodies heavy? The possible responses to this are, for example, all bodies are heavy, or not all bodies are heavy. Therefore, this is not a problem of deciding whether a proposition is true or false. Therefore, it isn't a logical problem in Leśniewski's sense. The problem concerns something other than propositions, namely bodies, and so is a physical problem, and therefore not all problems are logical problems. There are still scientific problems that are not logical problems. And Leśniewski goes through a similar argument involving Pythagoras' theorem, namely, on the one hand, the physical problem, is the square constructed on the hypotenuse equal to the sum of the squares constructed on the other two sides? And on the other hand, the logical problem, is Pythagoras' theorem a true thesis or a false thesis? Leśniewski says in the final paragraph to this note that to each true proposition, A is B, corresponds a true logical proposition, A is B is true. Of course, this could be continued to produce another logical proposition, A is B is true, and so on. Note 4 doesn't really seem to be that important, but Leśniewski says in this note that amongst the logical propositions and also amongst the scientific propositions, it's possible to distinguish two types of proposition. On the one hand, there are particular propositions, and some examples of particular propositions are Pythagoras' theorem is true. The proposition Paris is in the Kingdom of Monaco is false. And general propositions, some examples of general propositions are every proposition which forms the consequence of a syllogism in Barbara, which consists of true premises, is true. Every proposition which has a denoting subject and co-denoting predicate is true if the corresponding contradictory proposition is false. Every negative existential proposition is false. Every contradictory proposition is false. Section 2 is quite short, so I'll just read the whole translation of it. In the text of Section 1, I established that some of the propositions which are called the principle of the excluded middle are metaphysical or ontological propositions, yet others logical propositions. In the present work, I'll be concerned with the propositions of the second type. Under the name the logical principle of the excluded middle, I'll here understand and analyse the proposition at least one of two contradictory propositions must be true. My solution concerning this proposition can be applied mutatis mutandis to some other logical propositions called the logical principle of the excluded middle. Wanting to show that the logical principle of the excluded middle is a false thesis, I will introduce a pair of contradictory propositions of which neither is a true proposition. I note here that the statement of the principle of excluded middle says that at least one of two contradictory propositions must be true. This doesn't, of course, mean that it will ever be the case that both of the contradictory propositions will simultaneously be true, but the possibility hasn't necessarily been excluded. However, to prove that this is a false thesis, there is only one possibility. Exhibit two contradictory propositions, both of which are false. So just a couple of remarks here on my translations to Section 3. I've translated podmiot as subject and orzeczenie as predicate. Leśniewski often uses the verb oznaczać with podmiot, which I've usually translated as to denote. And he tends to use the verb współoznaczać in relation to orzeczenie. This word I decided to translate as to co-denote because I didn't know how else to translate it. The prefix współ to me gives a feeling of community or reciprocity, and I haven't come across this word before, but when Leśniewski uses it, he seems to be wanting to highlight a certain relationship or maybe unity between the subject and the predicate of a proposition, and between what, if anything, the predicate of a given proposition denotes, and what the subject of the same proposition denotes or co-denotes, and what the proposition itself as a whole symbolises. Leśniewski also uses the verb symbolizować, which I've naturally translated as to symbolise. With the subject of a proposition, he sometimes uses the word oznaczać and sometimes uses the word symbolizować, and thus I've tried to be consistent with my translation of these words. There's also a passage in this section relating to a certain convention of Leśniewski's, which I've translated in what seems like quite a clumsy way, as follows. A proposition can symbolise only the possession by the object, symbolised by the subject of the proposition, of properties co-denoted by its predicate. Now I find the wording here to be quite unnatural in English, and there was another way that I translated this passage, which was, a proposition can symbolise only that an object, which is symbolised by the subject of the proposition, possesses properties co-denoted by its predicate. This latter seemed to be a bit more natural, but which unfortunately seemed to lose the emphasis that Leśniewski seems to be placing on the proposition symbolising the possession of properties by the object, and it seems to place more emphasis on just the object itself. Thus, with reluctance, I opted for the former translation or something very similar. Also, in some of my translation to this section, I use the phrases no thing instead of nothing, and I translate things like nic nie oznacza as denotes no thing rather than does not denote. So let's have a look at this section. Leśniewski explains in section 3 that a system of linguistic symbols requires the following: principles of formation of symbols and rules for interpreting these symbols. These requirements are discussed in more detail, evidently, in another work of Leśniewski, Contribution to the Analysis of Existential Propositions, or Przyczynek do analizy zdań egzystencjalnych, and I hope to cover this work in some future videos. Leśniewski says, I established in my previous work various linguistic conventions showing exactly on which principles a system of linguistic symbols which I use relies, and also how a proposition of some or other construction which I make use of in my reasoning is to be understood. One of these conventions was the convention aiming to determine what some proposition must symbolise. This convention reads as follows: a proposition can symbolise only the possession by the object, symbolised by the subject of the proposition, of properties co-denoted by its predicate. In establishing this convention, I had the aim of unifying the dependency which exists between the symbolic function of the proposition and some or other words which constitute the given proposition. When Leśniewski speaks of the symbolic function of a proposition, he seems to mean that the proposition symbolises some object rather than no object. Moreover, a true proposition has a symbolic function. So now, Leśniewski forms two propositions which he goes on to prove in this section. The two propositions are: a true proposition always has a denoting subject. A true proposition always has a co-denoting predicate. Or otherwise, every proposition whose subject denotes no thing is a false proposition. Every proposition whose predicate denotes no thing is a false proposition. There is also a significant printing error at this point in the original text, which I've shown on the screen now. If these two propositions are proved, then it will show that we cannot have a proposition whose subject denotes no thing, or whose predicate co-denotes no thing, but which itself, the proposition that is, symbolises something. In other words, the proposition has a kind of unity, where if some part denotes no thing, then the whole symbolises no thing. The proofs of these two propositions are, in outline at least, as follows. Assume that some true proposition has a subject which denotes no thing. Then since the proposition is true, then the proposition must symbolize some object. Therefore, on the basis of the aforementioned convention, the proposition must symbolize, since it can only symbolize, the possession by the object, symbolized by the subject of the proposition, of properties co-denoted by the predicate. So the subject of the proposition denotes something, since if it denoted no thing, then no object would be denoted by this non-denoting subject, and so no object would be the possession by the object denoted by the subject of properties co-denoted by the predicate, and thus no object would be symbolized by the proposition. Therefore, the proposition would symbolize no object, which contradicts the original assumption that the proposition had a symbolic function. Therefore, the original assumption is false, and thus every proposition whose subject denotes no thing is a false proposition, must be a true statement. And it follows that all true propositions have a denoting subject. Notice that this argument seems to rely very heavily on the unity that Leśniewski emphasizes between the subject and predicate of a proposition and the proposition itself, and hence between what, if anything, the subject denotes and what the predicate co-denotes and what the proposition symbolizes. So now assume that some true proposition has a predicate which co-denotes no thing. Since the proposition is true, then the proposition must symbolize some object. Therefore, again, on the basis of the convention, the proposition must symbolize the possession by the object, symbolized by the subject of the proposition, of properties co-denoted by the predicate of the proposition. So the predicate of the proposition co-denotes something, since if it didn't, then no property would be co-denoted by this non-denoting predicate, and so no object would possess properties denoted by the predicate. In this case, again, no object would be symbolized by the proposition, which contradicts the original assumption that the proposition had a symbolic function. Therefore, the original assumption is false, thus every proposition whose predicate co-denotes no thing is a false proposition, must be a true statement. It follows that all true propositions have a co-denoting predicate. So Leśniewski finishes this section with the words, "The statements that I have proved in the present paragraph I shall use for the main problems of my work in the passages which follow." So that brings us to the end of this video. Depending on how much detail I want to go into and whether I think it's worth looking at all of the sections of this work, there may be 1 or 2 more videos looking at this particular work by Leśniewski. Leśniewski refers to many of his previous works in the footnotes to this work, and I do intend to make further videos in the future looking at some of these other works, so it may be that some things which are not entirely clear from this work alone may be clarified in other works. So thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. Keep an eye out for further videos being uploaded, and if you have any suggestions for topics for future videos, then feel free to let me know. Bye for now.